Welcome to the Ask a Theologian podcast with your host, Dave Olson. This is the show where profound theological ideas meet everyday understanding. Dave's years of experience as a pastor means he cares about breaking down the often dense and intimidating world of theology into approachable, user-friendly ideas. Whether you're curious about the revolutionary concept of the Trinity, the biblical lens on equality, or what it means to see humanity through God's eyes, this podcast is your guide to making sense of it all. Through engaging conversations with theologians and a dash of humor, the Ask a Theologian podcast invites you to explore faith, theology, and life from a fresh and insightful perspective. So grab a cup of coffee, settle in. The Ask a Theologian podcast with your host, Dave Olson.
Hey everybody, welcome to our show today. I'm excited to be able to chat with Dr. Richard Park. Dr. Richard Park is the Associate Professor of Theology at Vanguard University, previously at Biola, I believe. And he is an author, has written several books, The Visual Gospel, Calling the Blueprint, and your doctoral dissertation, Constructing Civility. I also saw somewhere that you've either just completed or in the process of completing a children's book.
Oh, that's right. I read my children's book. Not my most scholarly work, but in some way, a quite important one for me, at least.
I would think that'd be a very important one. Yeah, you do have a child. Is it Riley?
That's right, Rylan.
Okay.
Yeah, 5 years old.
Okay.
Yeah, and he's obviously the reason I turned my attention to children's writing.
Yeah, that's good. That's going to be a great challenge for a theologian to write kids' books.
Yeah,
I think it'd be wonderful.
Yes.
I have 13 grandkids, 12 one on the way, and some of them are in that same age group. And I know some of my kids will be thrilled to be able to have theological books or at least reasonably theological.
Yes, just on record, I suppose. I'd be happy to. Our nonprofit is actually, I'm giving away the first 2,000 printed copies. So
Oh, wow.
we're happy to sense that you got a lot that you can use. So
Okay, we can chat about that after. And speaking of which, you do run a nonprofit, the Renaissance. Can you tell us a little bit about that today?
yeah, so the main aim of the group is just to help other people find their calling and live it out in the kingdom, what we're talking about here. But our tagline is connecting calling to culture. And everyone finds their calling, they'll have to forge a culture of honor to God. So yeah, we do a lot of workshops at churches, online courses, and so forth.
Awesome. That's really cool. We want to talk mostly about calling and discerning your calling, and out of your book, Calling the Blueprint. And so my first question would be then, what kind of drove you? What was the passion behind that book? Because it's a switch from your doctoral dissertation.
Absolutely. Yes, that's right. Arguably, though, it came to me before the dissertation. It's something at around 30 years old. I was talking to a mentor of mine, considerably older, and who wrote a book on calling himself. And I asked him, this is my first time meeting him. I said, Dr. Guinness, what would you tell a 30-year-old who has interests as wide as this world, ashes that run deep? And he said a few helpful things. And then at the very end, he said, I would tell that 30-year-old to email me. And so that was a very kind invitation to friendship.
Yes.
But from around that time, and certainly earlier as well, I was struggling with this whole idea. What am I meant to do with the whole of my life?
Right.
And it's obviously something that I work with college students. And so it's something that a 20-year-old often asks as well. Maybe some earlier, maybe some later in life. But it is an area that I thought, gosh, if we can just get this close to right or right on point, then it would seem that it would change everything for an individual's life, for their community, society at large, and certainly for the church. And so that was the heart behind it. It really was writing it for myself. As I often tell my students, it took me 10 years to come up with my sort of 9-word calling statement. And it also took me about 10 years to really, I didn't start the book back then, but I was thinking through it for that time. But then on the other side of the dissertation and so forth, I decided to, as it were, put pen to paper and try my hand at it. And so that was the heart behind it, is helping myself in a way, but anyone else who's just really wanting to live all out for the Lord, but in a particular direction.
And for those listeners that are going to want to read the book, just a fair warning, it's not a scholastic, heavy academic book. It's written for everybody who wants to find their calling. But speaking of calling, we do hear that a little bit in the world around us, more often vocation or career or purpose. And
Yeah.
coming from a theological, biblical perspective, where do we find the idea of calling
Yeah.
broadly in Scripture?
Yeah, no, that's great. So the verses I typically go to when I write or speak on this sort of thing is really just two main areas. So Romans 12, kind of the classic passage. We all know the first couple of verses, offering our bodies as spiritual worship and then discerning the will of God. And rarely, as I again share with my students, do we think to connect it to the rest of the chapter, where from verses 3 onward, it really talks about the various ways in which you can make your whole life worship, as it were, according to the discerned will of God. And the thought there, of course, is when you bring that passage back to as an integrated whole, we see that we're meant to live our whole lives as worship, and that's done because we have a particular way we can do that in the following verses. And so that's the first place I go. So there's a will of God in our lives. That will of God is our whole life worship, offering our whole selves to God. But really, the only way we can do that is a very particular way. And that's what I would call calling. In 1 Peter 4, we also have something along the same lines where Peter's talking about, I love the phrasing of the varied graces of God, and having one, or at least one, as most theologians would argue, then let us use God's strength to then fulfill that particular or exercise that particular gift. And so 1 Peter 4, 10, 11, and then Romans 12, 1, and really most of that chapter really is where I would go. I would also want to note, though, of course, when we look at this in the time of the New Testament, let's just say roughly, it's a very different time than today, because in a lot of ways, for most of human history, I'd want to think that we wouldn't have had to even wrestle with this question, because you pretty much did what your father did or something like this. And so it is somewhat unique to our generation, or maybe the last couple of generations, but it's not missing from Scripture either. We obviously have Paul himself, who was called to be an apostle. Then there were others who were supporting him in that way, others who weren't, because they were meant to do other things with their time and with their efforts. And so there's examples of it, but much like other important doctrines that we see, they may not have the very use of the word calling, certainly not blueprint, but we see it evident in the way that we were made, and how we were made affects the way we're meant to live. And so again, Romans 12 and 1 Peter 4.
So calling, in your understanding of how you're using it, really is very closely tied to I would say it tied to two concepts or two ideas, gifting and worship. So how we use our gifts to worship. So I think that's an interesting idea. And I know in your book you talk about everything is worship, and I've sat on that for a little while thinking about that. And I grew up in a farm. My dad was a farmer from way back, and so we had a chicken farm with 50,000 chickens.
Wow!
And so obviously my first job had something to do with chickens. But I'm thinking about that. Okay, when I was in grade 12, I'm hauling a crew of chicken catchers around to catch chickens. I'm struggling. How is that worship?
Yes. So here I appreciate, of course, not all, but a good bit of what the reformers had to say on this topic, right? Luther, this is often found on Facebook or Instagram memes, but he didn't actually say this. But the thing we'll often see is the Christian shoemaker worships his God, not by putting little crosses on shoes, but by making shoes well. And he didn't so much say that in his meme, but he did say something similar in his letter to the German nobility. And he says, essentially, that there is no distinction between spiritual and secular. He says there are popes and priests, but there are artisans and so forth. Now that's overshooting it a little bit. I think there is a distinction, which we can talk about here. But I think the thought here is that there's a way dignifying every, as I like to put, ordinary corner of our lives as an act of worship. Now, I'm quick to make a distinction between corporate worship versus worship as a lifestyle. But in the second sense of our everyday lives, I think there's a real way in which, marked by excellence, an ordinary job could be part of our calling. So I think that's the idea is, again, in Colossians, we read about not just being so as eye pleasers, but doing it to the Lord. And so I think that dignifies everything we do and takes the ordinary or the mundane and truly make it majestic. And so I once gave a talk on this at a church, and a gentleman came up to me afterwards and said, I really appreciate your perspective on how to think of the 9 to 5 or the Monday through Friday. And he said, I think I've committed myself to filling out every Excel spreadsheet to the glory of God. And I thought, wow, that's beautiful. I could better than I could have put it. Whether he continues to do that today, that's I don't know. We don't get along, but everyone has a particular gift. and
Right.
perhaps something in accounting and so forth. So that was the heart behind the book too, is can we light folks up to live in the kingdom Monday through Saturday, in addition
Right.
to the glorious that we experience on a Sunday.
Traditionally, or at least in my background, growing up in a Pentecostal church, those who were called, that was a particular vocation. That was, you're called to ministry, and that's everybody else is, I don't know.
Yeah,
We just didn't
sure.
talk about it.
Yes. No, that's right. And yet, at least within the Assemblies of God, there's good reasons to see that anyone can be called to speak a powerful word in the very kind of
Giftings,
foundings
yes.
for time. But I think there is something about the idea that the pulpit, as it were, is sacred. It's a
Right.
place that isn't like any other in many ways. But there is where, as we were just referring to earlier, I'd make two sets of distinction. There's a sacred and the secular, of which those really ultimately refer to places of where we do our work and our worship. Right. So we might have a secular job, and I have no
Sure.
problem calling it that because it just happens to be outside the walls of a church, let's say, whereas sacred work is done in another location there in the church. But I think a more helpful way of thinking of that is, in a certain sense, there's sacred and secular spaces, though all of work is ultimately sacred if it's done unto the Lord.
Yes.
So that's why I make trouble for that distinction. But the better distinction, I think, is one that is profane versus holy, right? We can use that set of distinctions to indicate, hey, there are just certain jobs that even if you were to say, oh, it's my calling, profane. And so certainly it couldn't be, right?
Yeah.
And so
I'm
that's
not
where
doing this unto the Lord.
that's right. I get hypothetical questions from my students, certainly not genuine ones. I hope not, but they'll say, but Park, can't I, if everything is sacred, then what about X, Y, or Z, which we all know
Right.
anywhere close to being sanctioned by God, let's put it that way. And we would just say, well, look, there are things in this fallen world that are indeed profane. So it
Sure.
can never be a calling.
And even that line probably is a little bit blurry for some people as well. We're looking at Romans and conscience and all that. I'm just in the middle of reading Leo Total Kingdom of God.
Okay.
And of course, I don't know if you're familiar with it, but he argues for pacifism.
Oh, sure.
And
Yes.
that any type of military violence
Yes.
is anti-Christian, essentially.
Yeah. And then
And
you're saying he does something with Romans 14. Is that the thought?
no, I'm just thinking in
Yeah.
terms of coming from here in America, military is a big part of the culture.
Yes.
And I'm sure there would be a sense of we're doing this for God.
Yeah.
Tolstoy might say, no, that's not the case.
That's right.
So there's some room for conscience.
Yeah. Sorry.
The
Yes.
difference between the profane and the holy that way. Yeah, that's good. You mentioned earlier, you were saying about Paul, and Paul is called to be an apostle.
Yes.
But you're not restricting calling just to the fivefold apostle, prophet,
Sure.
pastor,
Yeah.
teacher, evangelist.
Yeah, in the sense that I'm using, you're right. I'm suggesting that there are those who are called to ministry in those ways, and then there are those who are not called to ministry in those ways, but their calling to dentistry, very much a calling too. Absolutely. So sometimes when folks hear me say everyone has a calling, it makes it sound like then there is no particular calling to ministry. But that just isn't true, because it's just as much a calling to any profession done unto the Lord. And so we can reserve that calling for ministers, as well as, again, dignify the calling of others as well.
I'm not sure if you're familiar with Alan Hirsch, but he wrote 5Q, which is his take on the fivefold ministries.
Yep.
Everybody has some of that gifting, but let's use it all week long, not just on Sundays.
Oh, that's another put it. Yes. No, I'm with 5Q. Okay.
5Q, yeah. He spent quite a bit of time in the 5Q. I was actually Assemblies of God pastor in North Carolina that put me onto that. So that's a great one. Hey, one thing I noticed you mention a lot in your book, and I think it's something that is talked about quite broadly in terms of growing in relationship and maturing and all that, is mentors. And to me, it seems like a more recent term. So my question is always, where are we finding that model biblically? The term isn't as important as the model.
Great. I'm glad you're noting that. Yeah. Sometimes when terms get in the way, it's better just to drop it. Yeah. But some of the clearer ones we probably are all familiar with is Paul to Timothy, and of course, Moses to Joshua, what have you.
Right.
But I would even look to the Lord himself. He had 12 disciples, but he had sort of his inner circle. And there was Peter, James, and John, who he gave particular attention to for certain purposes. And mentorship for me, I like to, again, as I work with young folks a lot, it's at 20 years old, you have about 120-year-olds around you all the time.
Yes.
But rarely do we actually remember that, wait a second, I give a mentorship assignment to my students, and they're meant to meet with someone 20 years older than them or older. And in the first day of class, going over the syllabus, where can I find such people?
Right.
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 But at the end of the semester, they say it's their favorite assignment. And so
Wow.
there's this part of the intergenerationality of church life and just everyday life that has gone by the wayside a lot with the kind of the move to modernity and kind of the
Sure.
mobility of life. But I think, again, we see examples of this throughout Scripture, but there's just the wealth of wisdom that we gain from being in those kinds of relationships.
Right.
And then I generally also recommend that it be of the same sex, women, generally speaking. And then also someone who, just two simple qualifications of, has a deep love for the Lord. And then ideally someone who might be in your general area of work. But first, of course, is far more important than the second. You can have a great mentor who's quite outside your area, but flourish in that relationship. But yeah, again, not to term, but I even see there is, and we're not going to use the term hierarchy either, but there is a sense in which the Lord himself has a different relationship with even his 12 disciples. Yeah.
Now, did I catch that right? That's an assignment you give your students to get a mentor?
To
That's brilliant. I love it.
Yeah. They meet with them 6 times in the semester. Advice can be online, this sort of thing. But as I say, that they often come back saying, this is the assignment I never knew I needed. And so then thankfully, not all, but a number of these relationships continue on beyond the classroom. But gosh, when I was in my younger years, I don't know if I'm supposed to say that yet, but
I can say it.
Okay.
You're going to have a beer like this.
Yeah. Okay.
I just grew it this morning. No.
Yeah. It's hilarious. Yeah. But I have a father who's a pastor and a wonderful man and who loves me and I love him. He would be the kind of dad who I've got a question for him or what have you. And he would pray for me and my sisters 3 weeks before he would say real three. He was affectionate, but he just wasn't a talker as much, but he loved the Lord. I always wish I had that kind of conversational relationship with, and following Dallas Willard there a little bit on that idea. But I think, gosh, how much our seniors among us, as it were, could pour into the young folks in our lives. And again, it's oftentimes, I don't know, because I'm not a grandparent. I don't have that kind of a distance, but my sense is when I'm at that stage of life, I could imagine being turned off to the idea because why would a 20-year-old ever want to spend time with me? Yet, again, this is the kind of, maybe both ways, but this is the kind of relationship we just don't know that we need and want.
Yeah, that's true. I think there's an important cautionary tale in the Old Testament. Solomon's son Rehoboam, asking for counsel, went to his peers and decided to take the peer instead of those who would have been his mentors.
Yeah.
And he made the wrong choice.
Yep.
So that's definitely there. Yeah, I think that's fantastic. There's a couple other thoughts in your book that I want to make sure we don't miss out. And one of them is where you connect passion and suffering. And can you tell me more about that? I'm not sure I like that part of your book, Dr. Park.
Yeah, that's right. Depending on what one is doing. But the heart of it is really following the passion of the Christ, as we say. So as Christ suffered, and for us, the word passion, which we use in the English all the time as something quite different from that, is actually quite telling, because when we make a distinction, the challenge is we've got so many interests, a lot of us, and myself included, and we've got so many options. All it takes is maybe one more year of a certificate, and now I can do X versus Y and so on, right? There's so many options. But what I try to do is try to make a distinction between interests and passions. And it's not just the words, as we say, but as we think about how we do have a lot of interests, but how many of those interests are we willing to suffer for in the Greek? What is it? What's truly our passion? What are we willing to suffer for? And at that point, maybe out of the dozen things we're interested in, and 1 or 2 remain. And part of the job of the book, I think, is to try to help us to go, okay, of the 20 things I can do with my life at 20 years old or whatever stage of life, we think, my goodness, I just need to whittle it down a bit. And making that distinction between an interest and a passion, I think, is one way in. And plenty of examples, but ones I often give my students is, say a student is interested in going to fashion work or something like this, or clothing design, and their salary may be quite small for the first year or 2 or 3 out of college, but it's their passion. They're going to do it with excellence because they're gifted in that sort of thing, in craft work. And then suddenly they recognize that getting paid such a little amount means nothing, doesn't bother them, because they're willing to suffer but there's, of course, other less trivial examples in that where suffering factors into our calling. And then, of course, Jesus, as we read in Hebrews 12, didn't just suffer. It was a joy that was set before
Right.
him.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so it is this, as I think I define it, something along the lines of a joyful commitment to exercise one's gifts. So
Right.
there's got to be a sacrifice, but also a joy. And Christ endured the cross for the sake of that joy. And so I think I don't want it to be, as you say, all displeasure, right? I think of other lines from movies. God has made me fast, and when I run, I feel his pleasure. And so I think Eric Little's calling, if you
Yes.
will, involved very much his running in the Olympics, but it's really a whittling down.
Yeah.
And
I
I
think
do the
this is
same with gifts and skills, because again,
right.
we can be skilled in a number of things. We can take
Sure.
the strengths finders, and again, it's modernity brings with it a myriad of options, and that myriad is sometimes what's so debilitating. So then when we can say, here's a skill, but really what's my gift that underlies that skill?
Right.
That's what we should be aiming at.
Yeah. I love the distinction, very practical,
Mm.
that passion, willing to put in the work, put in the time,
Yes.
more than just I can do it. I relate to wanting to do everything. I fondly call myself a neophiliac, and I just love new things.
Yeah, right,
So
right.
it's that. And I think when I was younger, somebody gratefully said, you can do anything you want, you just can't do everything you want.
Yeah.
And that was very helpful. And as you continue on the idea of worship in your book, and everything is worship, you actually spend quite a bit of time talking about liturgy. Maybe for those that are going to read it, can you tell me what you mean when you talk about liturgy? And I'm hoping we can get some concrete examples. I'm Pentecostal, grew up Pentecostal.
Yes.
Whereas we're supposedly as non-liturgical
Right.
as they come. I'm not sure that's true, but
Yes. No, that's great. And so in the beginning of the book, if I'm not mistaken, I say this is written for sort of two audiences of Christians,
Right.
and lowercase evangelical and Pentecostal.
right.
And here I think I have actually more in mind the evangelical, because for the evangelical, what doesn't matter is the material world,
Right.
including my body.
Sure.
What really
Yeah,
matters
ouch.
is the spiritual,
Cartesian.
this Cartesian dualism sort of thing working, and maybe even Gnosticism. And
It's gonna hurt.
sorry, I didn't mean to say all of it.
But the moving towards
Right.
the
That's
heavier
right.
emphasis on the mind.
Yes,
and,
absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so I think but you're right to point out that Pentecostals, we suffer this a bit in the sense
Yes.
of, we don't have liturgy. That's for Anglicans and
Right.
and Catholics and maybe a few Presbyterians or something. But going to the root of the idea, it really is a secular term that Paul picks up. It just means essentially a public works project. So it's a public service in kind of the Greek mindset. But then you've got it defined theologically as the work of the people. And so when we have a service on a Sunday morning, this is the order of worship, if you will, is essentially a kind of liturgy. It's the work of the people to God.
Right.
When I think of kind of aspects of Pentecostal liturgy, again, we might first balk at the term, but really there is an order of worship that's fairly predictable. And I'll just point out one in particular that kind of where we typically end is the altar call. And what I particularly appreciate about a Pentecostal liturgy there is that it respects and resources the fact that we are embodied beings. And it's voluntary. You come up or you don't.
Sure. Yeah.
And yet, when you go, for me, it's a vastly different closing of a liturgy. Now let's pray. The pastor will pray over you. Here's the applicational thought or two. But this is all invisible. This is all
Right.
spiritual, and therefore,
Yes.
in eyes, more superior. But wait a second, you take that step, and in just the way we raise our hands in worship,
Right.
all of this is very much embodied. And so, if anyone, I would say the Pentecostal has every reason to prize liturgy and to re-dignify it in a way that respects how embodied our lives are. And this is going a little bit further now, but I've been recently reading quite a bit in the area of social psychology and moral psychology. And
Sure.
I don't know how, but Jonathan Haidt in his work, that it's getting a lot of attention these days, mainly for the anxious generation, this sort of thing. Even prior to this, The Righteous Mind and other books, he's just talking about how we're moved first in our hearts before we actually justify or believe anything truly in our heads, as it were.
Sure.
I think we read in Colossians 1 about Paul writing to the church and saying that he's praying that we would come to grow in our knowledge of the grace of Christ, but
Right.
by the warming of your heart, essentially. And even Romans 12, where I again gave a workshop on calling, and one of the pastors said, wait, don't we read in Romans 12 where we're meant to renew our minds and then therefore be transformed? He told me this, after the Q&A. He said, I was going to ask this question, but Then I read verse 1 where it says off your bodies as a living
first.
sacrifice.
Yes.
So very much embodied, right? So
Yes.
I like to say, what we hold in our hearts, we first behold with our senses. And so
Right.
whether those senses are tactile or whether and moving or speaking in tongues or raising our hands or what may you name it.
Yeah.
And there's maybe a close relationship to what folks call the Roman Catholic calisthenics,
Yes.
to the Pentecostal practice
Sure.
that resource the body. And
Yeah.
I spent a solid, I want to say 2 or 3 chapters on liturgy, but that's really to remind ourselves, wait a second, we were here to begin with, but also to, kind of work against that.
I appreciate the definition of its works to the people. You're not the first person that I'm chatting to that's talking about the liturgical connection, especially with Pentecostals. I think it was Stephen Felix Jaeger who we were chatting, and he talked about how mainline denominational churches typically have communion or the sacraments Eucharist as a means of grace. He says, for us, it's worship. It's a singing. We expect God's presence to show up in that. And I think Daniel Costello talks about the connection, Pentecostals really more connected to the mystics of Christian history. And Tanya Harris, I don't know if Tanya, she did a research for her PhD in, I think it's 2006, where she studied Pentecostal churches in Australia. The exact same thing that Jonathan's said. They experienced it, then they worked it out. That was modern day.
Yeah.
And she found for understanding, hearing God's voice, that we probably needed to look at Catholicism for our framework for that rather than...
Wow.
So I think there's a lot of work being done on that. But I appreciate that. Concrete examples and understanding how that all works. I was going to ask you about the evangelical Pentecostal thing, but you've already explained that. So
Yeah.
I don't want to do that. Hey, one of the things that we do for our listeners, usually near the end of the podcast, is just ask if somebody wants to read more after they've read Calling the Blueprint and they've looked online and watched some of your YouTube videos, what other resources could they go to just to kind of help them work this out?
Yeah. So funny, we're just talking about evangelicals, and now I'm going to actually name one who, at least he considers himself one. But my mentor, Os Guinness, wrote a book called The Call.
Okay.
And that's where I have found it very helpful in terms of it's not deeply historical, but he does give a brief treatment of the notion of the call in historical development. And there's where I went to for some of the reformers' thought on it. And so it's much more of a devotional book, though. It's got 30 chapters, something like this. But that is one I would recommend. And quite outside either evangelical or Pentecostal circles. But I found my students really resonate with this other book written by, it's co-authored. One is a Christian, the other isn't. But Dave Evans and Bill Burnett have written a book called Designing Your Life. And they both teach a class over at Stanford. It's the most popular class as we can imagine because it's like, how do I figure out? And so then they wrote a book, but in it, they've got some very practical exercises one can do. And so these are, that's a very useful tool. I think there is a sense in which all truth is God's truth. And so we
of course,
grab it where we can. But I just find it so important to go to the practical things like that, because we all know folks, and there's just far too many. And according to Burnett and Evans research, it's close to 75%, but folks who would say that job and it's been and so forth. But as William Placker put in his book, Callings, he wrote, we serve a wise and good God who would take the needs of this world and match it up with the calling that we have. And so I love it because he's wise, because we got needs and we've got callings, but he's also good because he allows us to enjoy it. This is why I find it so important to grab whatever resource we can to help us along the way. And as I often like to say, and it's never too late. I walk with folks much older than myself in this journey, because some folks have a second career, like, oh, what am I supposed to do with my life? And I think it's a calling it's from the Lord, and it stays with us for a lifetime. And so we ought to discern it whenever we can.
Yeah. And we didn't get into it. And I think I'll direct the listeners to your book, where you talk about enjoyment. And as you brought up, enjoyment is a part of walking in our calling. There should be some enjoyment there. So that's excellent. I think this has just been a fantastic conversation. I know people are going to be helped by that and encouraged by that, raising the everyday to the level of meaningfulness and worshiping God. That's fantastic. So Dr. Park, thanks for taking the time to be with us today. Really appreciate it.
And thank you for living out your calling so well.
Thank you. And hopefully we'll get a chance to talk again sometime.
All right. Take care, brother.
This has been the Ask a Theologian podcast with your host, Dave Olson. It's a passion for Dave to have on theologians that break down the often dense and technical world of theology into approachable, user-friendly ideas. No thought or questions are off the table. We hope you've enjoyed the show. If you did, make sure to like, rate, and review. We'll be back soon, but in the meantime, find us on Instagram at the Ask a Theologian Podcast. And on X, it's Ask Theologian. Take care, and we'll see you next time on the Ask a Theologian Podcast.